Few people spent more time in Winston Churchill's company during the dramatic days of the Second World War than Jock Colville.
Private secretary, confidant, occasional pilot, and one of the greatest diarists of the Churchillian era.
Colville was reluctant to see Churchill taking office as Prime Minister in 1940.
But soon he became one of Winston's most loyal supporters and perceptive observers.
And through his diaries, he left us one of the most vivid portraits of Churchill ever written.
Find out more in this episode, The Loyal Diarist, on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye. With me, the sinister caretaker of the fairground to my Scooby-Doo is Dr. Warren Dockter. How are you doing, Warren?
I'm doing great, Richard. So today, I'm really excited about this episode, Richard. As we've been doing the Churchill Up Close and Personal series, this is one of my favorite characters. And nobody, I think, did more to commemorate and even shape Churchill's legacy than Sir John, who called himself Jock Colville. He was integral to Winston Churchill, and we get a real picture of Churchill the man through his work, and we're going to be talking about him today. And one of the most interesting things for me is when you go to Churchill College, as we have numerous times, and you go through the papers, you're going to feel Jock Colville's fingerprint on everything there, down to the actual building itself.
Absolutely. I guess one might think, why did Churchill need somebody to protect his reputation? Didn't it just automatically come about on account of his achievements and his fame and his own efforts through writing his memoirs? And as we'll see, of course, Colville was only making a partial contribution, that we're not saying that he was single-handedly responsible for Churchill being famous, but nevertheless, there were moments when Churchill's reputation seemed to be in abeyance or going into reverse, or he was attracting a lot of criticism. And that was really what I think motivated Colville to not merely speak out in his defense, but to take concrete actions, particularly around the foundation, not only of Churchill College, but of the Archive Centre, which he thought would essentially ensure that history did justice to Churchill.
That's right. And so what I also find about Colville that is really remarkable is not only was he a diarist in the room, understanding that he was a part of something enormous and that he was recording it for posterity and for history, which I think ultimately is where his true allegiance lied. We can talk about that later. But I think it's remarkable that for Churchill, became almost a surrogate son. I mean, Churchill very much clearly had a deep affection and respect for Jock Colville. And so the painting that he paints can be very sympathetic, but it's also one that I think shows warts and all to Churchill's character and to Jock's character. So I think that that's really remarkable.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that thinking about how the two came into contact, Colville's backstory, I would say, is not particularly exciting, actually, because he really, he starts his famous diary in the autumn of 1939, and by this point he's already become Assistant Private Secretary to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He's 25, so he was born in 1915. And if you compare what Churchill had achieved by the time that he was 25 versus what Colville had done, I mean, without trying to pour scorn on Colville, because of course most people don't achieve the kinds of things that Churchill did, but Churchill had fought in several wars and published multiple books. And of course, he'd had a lot of help in the sense that he had famous parents and so on. But if you look at what Colville had done prior to becoming a key part of the Churchill story, he'd gone to Harrow, as indeed Churchill had Harrow School. He'd gone to Trinity College, Cambridge. Churchill, of course, never went to university. And then in 1937, he joined the Foreign Office. And there's not too much in his biography which is super exciting before the outbreak of World War II.
That's one of the real interesting things is he's almost a voice in the chorus, a very, very particular English aristocratic, dare I say, chorus. And so it shouldn't surprise us that actually in the initial parts, that this is in the diary, he's extremely skeptical of Churchill because Churchill still got that element of the radical, weird guy who seems to just be a warmonger and an outlying figure. On the other hand, in the early diary, Jock Colville's respect and admiration for Neville Chamberlain is very apparent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point because Chamberlain is often belittled, criticised, and I mean, I think there are many legitimate criticisms you can make of Neville Chamberlain, but you've got to think of him as somebody who was commanding not only respect, but a sort of even love from some Conservative MPs. And so the fact that Colville admired him is not necessarily a case of bad judgment, but rather, as you say, the scepticism towards Churchill was probably much shaped by his media image and maybe also by the back chat that he might well have heard from people in the Chamberlain circle.
Which makes complete sense, really, because Colville's such an establishment figure. The fact that he's running a Neville Chamberlain circle illustrates that. But I think really by May 1940, things start to change, and you can see how the Norway debate really showed that Chamberlain's government was not going to survive this crisis. Colville recorded in his diary on May 10th, "I'm afraid that it must be Winston." So you can see that he's very trepidatious about Churchill and having to deal with Churchill. And of course, he's in the position of being private secretary to the prime minister, which means that if it's Winston, he'll have to work with Winston regardless of his political relationship.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is probably really important for non-British listeners to appreciate that there is in Britain a permanent civil service. There aren't generally in the same way political type appointments. So, I mean, essentially, Churchill, yes, he would have had a choice of private secretary if he'd really not been able to get on with Colville. The default assumption would be that you would carry on with the same officials. And so there you therefore get this, what might seem like a quite unique experience of somebody who worked very closely with Neville Chamberlain, very sort of orderly figure who likes routine, and then the rather more chaotic but much more energetic situation once Churchill has come in. And so Colville was quickly captivated by Churchill's energy and really does fairly quickly become a big pro-Churchill enthusiast.
I think he's at first overwhelmed by the energy and shambolic or chaotic approach that Churchill has, and then really comes to admire that in this, he's not just spinning his wheels, he's actually getting things done. But that is one of my favorite entries in his diary to begin with, is when he first starts working with him. On day number 1, he's allowed to go home at 1 a.m, which from the Chamberlain life of like everything's a 9 to 5 standard working hours must have been an absolute system shock.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the most striking remarks he makes, not in his diary, but in a later account published in the 60s, he says that obviously everybody was very concerned about the direction that the war was going. And he said, well, I knew things probably were going to be okay when I saw a permanent secretary, that is like the highest official in a government department, running down the corridor in his shirt sleeves because Churchill sort of injected this energy into the system. I mean, the civil service was in its own way efficient, but perhaps not especially speedy. And so by essentially sometimes literally banging the table, but certainly by writing strongly worded minutes and so on, Churchill does succeed in shaking things up and moving away from the sort of more complacent business as usual type model.
That's right. Well, and this is where our phrases KBO and then of course action this day come from, him manhandling this bureaucracy into submission and adjusting itself to his rather peculiar working style. I don't know if we've ever talked about, so I'll just mention Churchill would regularly rise late, although he would expect the civil servants to already be there working. So they're having to keep standard 7:30, 8 a.m. starting times. He would get up, I guess later, maybe around 10:30, and would work through, although he would have an afternoon siesta. And again, he's still expecting his staff to work through his siesta. And then he would work often until 2 or 3 in the morning. And then some of that morning he would be in bed reading papers or dictating things. So he was working from bed, which is for some reason my staff won't let me do.
Well, I don't think you're supposed to bring the bed to the office.
They keep telling me that. But what is remarkable in this, and for us historians, is that we are all able to understand and fully come to terms with this because Jock Colville wrote one of the most important books that reveals the true character of all this coming together. And it was called Fringes of Power, which is his Downing Street Diaries, which is just an incredible record. Now, it's edited here and there, of course, but this is a true accounting, I think it would be fair to say, what was happening on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, and I mean, of course, Colville, he wasn't supposed to be doing it,
No,
actually,
no, it's
either.
completely secret.
And one of his colleagues, called John Peck, later said, "I'm filled with amazement at the risks Jock was running in the matter of security, for which he would have been sacked on the spot if he had been caught." Now, there were actually quite a lot of people, I think, who were one way or another. We talked about Alan Brooke last week. We
Yeah.
talked about Lord Moran, Churchill's doctor. Quite a lot of people around Churchill thinking, well, this guy, seemed quite interesting. Maybe I should write some of this down. And also, maybe assuming the war comes out all right, maybe a book based on this could be my meal ticket in the future. I'm not saying that was Colville's motivation, but obviously some people must have thought of that. But what I would say is that there's a bunch of people writing down what happened. Not all of them are interesting.
Right. And I mean, that goes back to the fact that despite taking on this risk, Colville is totally dedicated to the idea that historically this is important. Now, I'm not saying he's not looking for a payday, but Colville, I think, is doing this because he thinks history demands it.
So in a way, one of the things which Colville successfully does is fill in some of the gaps and some of the more informal moments. British official record keeping was pretty good. He didn't need to duplicate or substitute for that, but he gets the stuff which would otherwise go off the record. So, for example, Churchill is again a broadcast to the French people. He has a translator there to help him, and Colville records Churchill shouting, "Where is my frog speech?" kind of within the hearing of the translator, a little bit tactless. And he even says that when they're recording in this cramped bunker, then the translator, Michel Saint-Denis, ends up sitting on Churchill's lap. I mean, sometimes with these things, was that literally true? Okay, but we get the impression that it was pretty squashed in there. And so I think that Colville, he's got an eye for detail, let us say.
Well, and that's imbued in his diary, I think. But one of the interesting things I really think speaks to his qualities as a man and as someone committed to Britain is that despite him being there with Churchill, being at the seat of power, he decides it's actually more important for him to go off and serve. So he joins the Royal Air Force in October 1941. And he actually flew during the invasion of France until ultimately he would come back and serve Churchill later in the war. So he sees action himself because he insists on doing that, which I think is remarkable for a diarist.
Yes, and I think also that's something which Churchill valued. He was obviously in a bit of a bind because on the one hand, he's got somebody who's very effective at working with him. On the other hand, he's going to respect and value the fact that they want to be in the armed forces. So I suppose Churchill may have been a bit reluctant to let Colville go, but he wouldn't have stood in his way and would only have strengthened his respect for him.
That's absolutely right. And we'll talk about what the legacy of that is after the break. Welcome back to Churchill, the finest half hour. Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me as ever is the Shaggy to my Scooby-Doo, Professor Richard Toye.
So I'm just coming back after my recent ride in the Mystery Machine, which I took during the break. Colville, after the war, he serves a stint as private secretary to the young Princess Elizabeth. This is actually a somewhat common transition, actually. But then, of course, Churchill is out of power in 1945 through to 1951. And Colville also works with Clement Attlee as Prime Minister, somebody else who he respects, I think, much more cautiously than he does Churchill. But Attlee, again, has, how shall I say, some of the middle-class manners and bearing, which Colville would probably think made you a good chap, whereas some of the rougher working-class Labour leaders he would have been less comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's true. But anyway, he and his wife went on a vacation in October 26, 1951, one day after the general election. And so it shouldn't surprise anyone, although it was perhaps a surprise to Colville's wife, Margaret, that they went to go see the horse races and someone approached Jock Colville and said, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, is on the phone for you. And I love this because he records this in his diary. Margaret, sensing that this was going to be a huge change for them, warned her husband, whatever he asks you to do, say no, which is what I imagine Christine says anytime I call you, Richard.
So, of course, similarly, Colville cannot refuse the lure of the great man. And Churchill says to him, would you, if it is not inconvenient, I quite like that because he probably took no account of whether or not it was really, really convenient. Would you take a train to London to come and see me? And Colville says, okay, I'll come tomorrow morning. And Churchill says, no, this afternoon. So to hell whether it was convenient or not. And so in a nutshell, Colville goes back into his previous position, but of course, this isn't wartime. Churchill is now 77. The situation has changed significantly.
Yeah, and so it's interesting when he gets back, Churchill had gotten all these private secretaries, as we were talking about how the civil service works in Britain, that Churchill would have inherited from Attlee's government. And he just looks at Colville when Colville inquires, why not use these guys? They're for you. Churchill, and you can imagine it. I really want you to say the line, Richard, because your accent for Churchill is better, but I'll do it. He just looks at Colville and he said, drenched in socialism. I made him Richard Nixon. I don't know what that was.
So in a sense, there is a bending of the rules here, and in order to get Colville back, and really Churchill was somebody at this stage who wanted familiar faces around him, and this went for sort of political colleagues as well at the ministerial level. And I think that it is undoubtedly the case that Churchill was less able than he had been during the war.
And in fact, I think Churchill, we've talked some about Churchill's health when we were talking about Lord Morn, but he was in a serious decline at this point. And so by June in 1953 is probably one of the major serious health scares that we've had around Churchill, and he has a massive stroke when he was actually at dinner with the Italian Prime Minister. And basically at the dinner, Colville, along with Churchill's son-in-law, Christopher Soames, helped pull Churchill away. And then the two of them, and to a lesser degree, Rab Butler, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically came together and ran the government while Churchill was incapacitated, which I think we're describing as a conspiracy of silence. And the reason I say that is they kept Churchill's health and the fact that he was incapacitated as a complete secret from the public.
Yes, there were lots of rumors that were flying around, and the Daily Mirror in particular was asking questions and pushing the boundaries. So I think that just as people had become quite good during the war at noticing when Churchill's presence wasn't being reported in the House of Commons, and people would put two and two together and say, well, he must be on one of his wartime trips. So people did start to raise questions, but there was a limit to the degree to which you could do that explicitly. These days, in a modern media environment, you would not get away with it.
Yeah, it would be completely impossible in today's environment. But to give you an idea, Colville and I think Rab Butler and Christopher Soames summoned people like Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Camrose, who were both press barons. We've talked about how Churchill secretly always wanted to be a press baron, and asked them not to cover them. They were very explicit with them. So Beaverbrook and Camrose especially were in on the conspiracy, and as a result, they kept it from leaking out to the broader public. And I think Colville's actually signing stuff as Winston Churchill at one point. So, how in control is Colville? I said once that he was almost an unelected prime minister for 3 months, which is maybe over egging the pudding. But I think that the case is still an interesting one because it is a constitutional crisis in a way. But the fact that no one ever found out about it kept it from being that.
Yeah, the official word is that Churchill is in need of complete rest. And you must think, well, if he needs complete rest, what is wrong with him, which requires that to be the case? But I think that illness was also more tolerated in leaders in this period. And there wasn't quite this assumption that the prime minister has to be on top of every single decision. And Churchill, even when he was much healthier earlier in this period, had been much more low key about the number of speeches that he was making, how often he was appearing in the House of Commons.
Yeah. The other thing, and I should have mentioned this, why this becomes a crisis is Anthony Eden, who actually would have probably been set up to be successor to Churchill, was himself incapacitated, recovering from a botched gallbladder surgery, which was very complex in those days. But the point is, Anthony Eden can't step up. He's totally out of the picture. So Colville, Rab Butler, and Christopher Soames are behind the scenes running the government on the DL while Churchill's out of the limelight. But Colville is prescient enough to record in his diary that he doesn't want his own judgment to be given a prime ministerial effect, which I think is really remarkably prescient given the situation, that he's trying not to read himself as if he were prime minister. He's like, what would Winston do?
Sure. We should say, of course, that Churchill did make a remarkable recovery from that episode and continued until April 1955 as Prime Minister, though doubtless somewhat weakened. Colville is still there, and he has ideas of his own. And I did come across this document where Colville comes up with his sort of own plan to end the Cold War. This is at a time where Churchill is trying to create détente with the Soviet Union, very much wants to go and have a summit with the Soviet leaders. The Americans are very hesitant about that. Colville's idea is, well, maybe we can use racism to solve the Cold War, because really us and the Russians have got more in common than we think, and that the real threat, as he puts it sort of in quotations, the yellow peril, i.e. the Chinese. So in a sense, the Russians, the British and the Americans should all coordinate or sort of gang up against the Chinese. Now, fortunately, I think the other civil servants make sure that this goes nowhere near Churchill, who I don't think would have actually taken it particularly seriously. But it does show, first of all, that you don't necessarily see this from the diaries, but there is a strong conservatism there in Colville's thinking. And that also, I mean, just possibly, he was a guy who really sort of dedicated his life to another person without much agency of his own, and that maybe he did actually have political ideas that he would have liked. So Colville did consider standing as a Conservative candidate in the 1945 general election. I mean, I think that politics probably wasn't his forte, that he was better off being a civil servant and a diarist and eventually a defender of Churchill's reputation. But maybe he did crave action, which, of course, again, might explain his desire and successful attempt to go off and serve in the RAF during World War II.
Well, and to your point, one of the political differences, that intense conservatism that he comes from is very much a part of his class, I think, that I find deeply irritating is at times I would almost describe him as anti-American, at least compared to Churchill. Churchill, of course, is very he sees the genetic connection between North America and the United States and Great Britain, the English-speaking peoples and so forth, whereas Colville's much more suspicious of the United States, and particularly taking a back seat to the United States during the second administration. He is very, very suspicious of Truman and then Eisenhower. And so I think that these differences you can see in the actual diary. But what's really interesting is once Churchill himself goes away from power, this is a moment when Colville steps into that role as the guardian of Churchill's legacy.
That's right. So he leaves the civil service at the same time as Churchill leaves office in April 1955. He becomes an investment banker, and Colville uses that position to help raise money for the founding of Churchill College, Cambridge, which is the national memorial to Churchill. And when Churchill expressed regret, this is a time of Cold War worries that the Soviets are pulling ahead. He's worried about Britain's failure to produce enough technologists and scientists. Colville replies, I will raise the money to found a college which was predominantly intended for scientists.
That's right. I mean, Churchill had seen MIT in America and wanted a British version of that, and actually originally thought that it might be in Birmingham. But it ultimately winds up as a college in Cambridge because Jock Colville went to Cambridge, and that was the network he had to work with to help raise the money. Colville takes this work in raising the money and building the archive center and the college very seriously. So when Lord Moran published his diary in 1966, remember, he's still trying to raise the money and get this college paid for. So he has to be active in helping secure Churchill's legacy against these things that sort of reveal blemishes in Winston Churchill. And so you can see him writing in the papers, doing all this stuff to counteract the stuff that Lord Moran's saying.
And so Colville published, first of all, Action This Day, a sort of edited collection of people who'd worked with Churchill in 1968. He published some volumes of memoirs. And so he was quite prominent, but he didn't actually publish his diaries until 1985, at which point he was 70 years old. And only 2 years later, he died suddenly on the platform at Winchester Station in November 1987. But nevertheless, he himself left this important legacy in the form of the Jock Colville Hall, which is adjacent to the Archive Centre, where he also did such a role, not merely in helping to build it, but encouraging other politicians to deposit their papers there.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And so in many ways, he built a legacy for himself to show the world who Churchill was as a man and to preserve all of these documents and papers and to really become one of the foundational research centers that's perhaps only second to the National Archives. So I think he was a part of something that was remarkable. He also went to lengths to, again, fight in Churchill's favor, although in some instances I think it's sort of ridiculous the extent that he goes to try to say Churchill didn't suffer from any kind of depression. This is just normal stuff. I think it's clear, like we discussed that on the Lord Moran episode, there was something there. Was it a full-blown melancholic depression that made him suicidal? Absolutely not. But Churchill did suffer from anxiety because he was a human being. One of them that I've always thought was really interesting, and I always felt like Colville did this for an American audience, was the extent to which he tried to dispel the idea that Churchill drank too much. Churchill did drink a lot, and he even courted the idea that he drank too much. And that was a part of his persona. Colville understood that this would not be, I'm going to say, apropos for an American audience that still looked down at drinking. And so went out of his way to say, oh, he always drank extremely watered down stuff. And I'm not saying that maybe he didn't put water in it, because, of course, he was a gentleman that would water his scotch down. I've drunk Johnny Walker Red, and you would not water it down to the extent that Colville's claiming like it was a strong mouthwash. That's gross.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So how are we going to sum up Colville? He was somebody who, in a sense, ended up being thrown into a position of proximity to one of the leading figures of the 20th century, not entirely by accident, because that was a profession that he'd chosen, but certainly somebody who was converted from a skeptic to an admirer, and then, in effect, did dedicate much of his life not only to serving him, but to serving his memory.
That's true. And I think even though he was devoted to Churchill, almost in the way a samurai would be devoted to a shogun, he was his own man. For instance, he went off to the RAF. He did his own things when Churchill left the scene. And for me, one of the towering things of Colville's legacy is the fact that he, above all else, was devoted to history and historical memory and helped produce one of the greatest archive centers on earth.
Jock Colville spent decades protecting Churchill's reputation.
But he also understood that the real Churchill, flawed, exhausting, brilliant, and deeply human, was more interesting than any myth.
Next time, we'll be doing something a little different.
A special Churchill Mythbusters episode tackling some of the most persistent stories and misconceptions about Churchill's life and career.
And if you'd like to keep the conversation going,
join our LinkedIn group and stay in touch with the podcast community.
And in the meantime,
KBO.